Beth Moore has found herself in a similar situation. She said, which I know she was trying to be snarky, which again, she's put herself in this situation of constantly having to kowtow to people who are woker than her. She said that was scarier than a Southern Baptist convention. So she's trying to make a joke. She left the Southern Baptist convention. A lot of it had to do with, I think it probably had to do with Southern Baptist support of Donald Trump, but it also had to do with a lot of criticism towards her preaching because she preaches and teaches in front of men, particularly in a pulpit. And so she, of course, has been very offended and disenchanted because of some of the words of the people, I guess, in leadership or just who are a part of the Southern Baptist Convention. Maybe some of her feelings are justified, maybe not, but she doesn't like the Southern Baptist Convention. And so she said that was scarier than a Southern Baptist Convention. And then Lisa Harper, there's two Lisa Harpers. There's a Lisa Harper, she's a Christian author, but this Lisa Harper, she's got like pronouns in her profile. I think she also considers herself a Christian author, but she's like very unabashedly woke. So like in her name on Twitter, she's got she, her. So that tells me personally all that I need to know. But she quote tweets Beth Moore and she says, perhaps the violence displayed between Will Smith and Chris Rock at Oscars 2022 was, quote, scarier than the Southern Baptist Convention because it was an open display of the outcome of 4 centuries of violence by Southern Baptists on bodies, minds, and souls of African descent. Hold up. The slap between Will Smith and Chris Rock has to do with Southern Baptists owning slaves 400 years ago? Can you square that circle for me? Can you help me understand? Is this something that only makes sense if you speak critical race theory? I mean, I know I'm fluent in critical race theory, unfortunately, because I've read so much about it and talked so much about it. But this must be like a dialect of critical race theory that I'm not familiar with, because usually I can try to understand how they're making the connections. But here, it's really tough for me to understand what she's trying to say. But, actually, she explains it. So let me go on in her tweet thread. It was Chris Rock's bow to white patriarchy. Oh, sometimes I just can't get through this stuff. By undercutting a sharp black woman's hair and calling her less than a woman in front of billions of people. Except that's not really what he was doing. Again, agree or disagree with Chris Rock's joke. I understand why Jada Pinkett Smith was offended. And I understand why Will Smith would be offended on her behalf. Even if something is a joke, it can be hurtful. But is it really about a white patriarchy? So every time a black person tells a joke about another black person or a black woman, that's whiteness? That's white patriarchy? Or maybe it's just them telling a joke. Like, did you think of that? Maybe it's just not that complex. She goes on to say, she said, calling her less than a woman in front of billions of people. That might be my favorite part. That she thinks that billions of people watch the Oscars. I guarantee it probably wasn't even 1 million people. It was probably hundreds of thousands of people. Billions of people. That's awesome. Then she goes on to say, it was Chris Rock's choice to belittle a human being with a disability. Disability? Alopecia is definitely a disorder, a serious one. A disability? I don't know. The roots of white supremacy do not consider the disabled human. Therefore, they are unprotected from humiliation. So do you see what they do? Do you see what these race baiters and racial justice activists do? White supremacy is a stand-in for all kind of evil. So really what she's doing, she is actually abdicating not just Will Smith of responsibility, but also Chris Rock. Because this is just Chris Rock's manifestation of internalized white supremacy that, of course, was imparted on him by the white supremacists of yore, I guess the Southern Baptists. She goes on to say, we all saw the outcome of body trauma, and it shook us because we were watching internalized violence. Again, internalized violence. So again, Will Smith, she is saying, is actually a victim in this case. We watched internalized violence spill out on an international stage and no one knew what to do. So they did what we have done in this nation since 1619. Nothing. Literally no thing. We've done nothing. The Emancipation Proclamation was nothing. We've done nothing since 1619. The Civil Rights Act was nothing. Actually, that is what critical race theory asserts. That's what 1619 Project asserts, that since Since 1619, racism, not just racism, but systemic white supremacy and forms of slavery have just evolved. They haven't actually fully gone away. What's incredible is that we are talking about the Oscars. We are talking about two Black multimillionaires who have more money than most white people could ever even imagine happening. And we are talking about this being a scenario that is similar to 1619, when Black people in America were treated as cattle. Really. This is the same thing as 1619. These people in suits that probably cost more money than most white people in America make in an entire year. This is an example of white supremacy. This is an example of 1619. Really. But again, this goes back to the tenets of critical race theory, is that any example, any seeming example of progress toward equality is actually not real. It's actually not an indication of real progress, and is actually just an exception to the rule of systemic racism. Like, don't you see how this whole argument is non-falsifiable? And she said, I have watched the responses, the white women's calls for criminal prosecution, the Black women's protection of Will Smith, saying they hope their husbands would respond the same way. Neither of these paths get us to peace or justice, and that is what we all want. Okay, not the worst thing that she said. She said the U.S. is the most violent and incarcerated nation on the planet. Violence dehumanizes. Dehumanization is our norm. We dehumanize when we criminalize. We dehumanize when we criminalize. Well, what if someone is a criminal? What if someone commits a crime? We dehumanize when we criminalize. You don't want to criminalize any actions. We shouldn't criminalize violence. We shouldn't criminalize murder. I'm not saying Will Smith needs to go to jail. We dehumanize when we criminalize. Well, no, you criminalize because you are humanizing victims. You decriminalize, you victimize. That's the truth. And she said, and we dehumanize when we justify and accommodate violence. Yes, this is just all hogwash. It doesn't make any sense, and it's incoherent. Accommodate violence because we lack hope for the healing of our trauma. Beth Moore says, Lisa, I appreciate the pushback. I was not thoughtful before I tweeted. Look, I don't agree with Beth Moore's original tweet, just like I don't probably fully agree with Glennon Doyle's original tweet. But you don't have to go back. You don't have to take it back. You don't have to roll it back. You don't have to implicitly apologize. You don't have to explicitly apologize unless what you said was legitimately wrong and you believe it was wrong and you regret it. That's one thing. I'm all for sincere apologies. I am completely against apologies for the sake of apologizing or for the sake of trying to win favor with people who are always going to be committed to misunderstanding you and pushing their own narrative. What Lisa Harper said here was ridiculous. It did not merit any kind of legitimate response from Beth Moore. Again, be willing to stand by what you say if you actually meant what you said. But unfortunately, it seems that white women, including white Christian women, are so used to believing that humility and empathy and love just means bowing down to whatever the rage mob, especially the racial rage mob on Twitter and on Instagram, tell them to do. And I'm telling you, that is not of God. That is not actual humility. That's fear.